Hey everyone, welcome back to The Red Path. It's Dar here with you today, and I've put together a video on how to paint a Khorne Berzerker in the classic World Leaders color scheme. The techniques that I'm going to be using here today are all very accessible, and with enough practice you should be able to add them into your own routine pretty easily. So without further ado, let's grab ourselves a brew and get into the video. So before we begin, the footage for this video is actually a compilation of a series of painting streams that I ran over on our Twitch channel. So if you want the full uncut version, you can find it on our VODs there. We've recently launched our Twitch channel and it's been a really big success, so if you haven't already checked it out, please do. Dropping us a follow or a sub, be it Twitch Prime or otherwise, really helps us out and goes a long way in supporting the Red Path. You can find me painting there twice a week on Mondays and Thursdays at 8 PM BST, painting a variety of different miniatures. At the minute we're working on a custom Tzeentch Herald and a Land Raider Proteus, so drop by and say hi, I'd love to see you hanging out there. Anyway, let's get stuck into this tutorial. Alright, so let's start off with looking at the miniature here. So for this build, what we wanted to do was replicate the Codex cover art from our 9th edition Codex, trying to build that Berzerker that we all know and love. So for this kit, we've used a mix of different things. The core of the kit is the Berzerker new 40k kit. So that's what we have for the torso, for the head. Now the head, we picked one that kind of looked as similar as possible to that front cover art as we could. Then the weapons, so one of them is Coward's Bane from the Invocatus kit, with a slight kind of kit bash where I've chopped it off and basically reattached it to a Berzerker's arm. And the other arm and chain axe is actually from the 8-band kit because we wanted to get that big muscular kind of bear arm. Then the backpack is also from the Juggerlord kit. So that kind of all comes together to make this miniature, which then we've primed black and just gotten it ready for painting. So yeah, that's pretty much the build. Now what we're going to do is start by painting the red armor. So that's going to be coming up next. So, beginning the red armor for this Berzerker, we are starting with a mix of Wordbearer's red, which is our primary color here, and Abaddon black and Rhinoxide. We're just trying to darken up that quite strong brick red color to make sure that we're not going in with anything too harsh, too bright, or too garish from the get-go. The reason that we're starting with such a dark color is so that we can gradually build up from here by blending in more of these reds, like Wordbearer's red, eventually getting to Mephiston red and things like Evil Sun's scarlet, so that we can sell quite a cool bright to dark transition. Now, the reason that we're doing this is because if you actually go back and look at the Codex cover, while the miniature looks like he has very bright red armor, this red is actually selectively applied and your eye is just drawn towards those very bright segments of the armor rather than the overall image, which is actually a composition of very dark reds which almost become browns and blacks at some point, working into those bright, vibrant, strong reds. So we're trying to sell that effect here, and I would recommend that if you're working on the 40k scheme and you want something cool and different that doesn't necessarily look blocky, for want of a better word, that you might try and do this kind of gradation. It's very simple. Red is a very easy color, very forgiving color to work with, and as you can see here, we're just gradually blending in more Wordbearer's red until we get to a point where we're just using pure Wordbearer's red. Then we're going to start to gradually introduce Mephiston red into the mix and then get brighter and brighter up until the point where we can kind of sit back and say, you know what, I'm happy with how this is looking now. So you're kind of going to see how that progresses here. But I think it's quite a satisfying way to paint the 40k color scheme as well. And if you're brand new to the whole kind of painting experience and painting world leaders, it's actually really fun to try and learn this technique rather than going in from the get-go and just saying I'm going to block out this miniature in just pure strong Wordbearer's red or Mephiston red or whatever red you choose. Try building up a little transition layer like this, because I think the final effect, once you kind of sell it, once you work it out, will actually be really satisfying to pull off. So give it a go and see how it goes for yourself. Anyway, let's see how the rest of this red armor comes out. So as we get closer to the point where we're working with quite bright reds, like this Mephiston red mix here, what we need to start considering is exactly how much of that red that we are going to be applying to the surface area of the armor. Now this seems like a kind of a weird thing to say, but one of the strongest and best ways that you can do to build up powerful shadows is by selectively applying this color. And what I mean by that is when you're actually sitting down with the brush and going in, attacking the miniature, you want to actually hit less surface area than you might think. It's a strange kind of concept to get your head around, but in order to build up a strong transition, a strong clear transition from darks to brights, what you need to do is you need to remember that these bright tones are only going to be applied at the highest point of the miniature. Like, let's look at this Wild Rider red layer here, for example. We're working very close to the topmost part of the trim and leaving a significant portion of the lower part of the greave here. And that's so that we're leaving a lot of that darker tone and getting this really nice graded blend working up here. Now this is probably the most advanced and difficult part of the technique, and really it's not so much the brush control but rather the mental fortitude to actually say, okay, I'm not going to work this nice bright red down into the shadowed areas, I'm going to leave those because they're fine, they're meant to be there. And the finished product is this really nice transition from dark to red, which you can kind of see here, and overall presents quite a cool image of a strong red going into deep shadows. But of course, let's start weathering it. For this, we're going to do a little bit of the classic sponge chipping method with Rhinox hide all over the miniature, going in kind of light. We don't want any powerful chips coming in at this point, but we're also going to take a very thin brush and come in with some scratch markings, again with the Rhinox hide and Abaddon black mix. Very faintly attacking the model. The brush is barely touching the surface area, so control here is very important. I recommend bracing your hand against the table while you're trying to do a technique like this. Moving on now to the metallics, what we started here with is a base coat of Jet Exhaust Burnt Iron, a very dark bronze kind of effect. What we're going to start doing to make sure that this metallic tone looks really good, this bronze tone, because really when you think about it, it's the thing that frames the red armor. We want it to be very potent, and if you look at the codex cover, it's quite a bright bronze that they've got going on. So again, starting with a really dark tone here, we're going to work up into a very bright bronze color, which is so bright that it's actually almost silver. We're doing this by starting to blend Runelord Brass into the Jet Exhaust Burnt Iron base coat, again working away from the shadows. We can be a little bit choppier here because it's a metallic tone, and a little bit of a choppy kind of effect sometimes looks pretty good for the metallics. It's not always a very clean and smooth blend when it comes to these kind of things. But as we move on, we're going to start working in brighter and brighter metallics until we get to just Runelord Brass, and then eventually we're going to start working the really bright stuff like Canoptic Alloy to make sure that we have a powerful way of framing this red armor that is going to sell it in a very interesting kind of light. Again, control here is very important. When it comes to metallics, it's often like more pronounced that the darks are very dark and the brights are very bright. So our darkest dark here, that Jet Exhaust Burnt Iron, is going to be so much darker than our highest bright, which is going to be Canoptic Alloy. As you can see here, we're starting to work it in, and you can already see the transition between the darkest parts of the bottom of the knee pad or this shoulder pad here right up to the highest points. It's a powerful effect, and learning how to control it is difficult to do at the start, but once you get the hang of it, it's very easy to replicate. We're going to move on now to the leather and bone components of this miniature. Now, painting leather and bone can be a somewhat arduous and boring process if you decide to kind of go the whole hog and work from a dark to bright tone, which is kind of what we're doing here. Now, ordinarily on an average Berzerker miniature, I may not spend so much time actually working on this because we start off with a very dark base coat like Rhinox hide, and we're going to work the whole way up to a shabty bone for some of the components here, which can be real boring, but the final effect is very nice if you sell it well and you understand how to partition your dark tones from your light tones. The alternative here would be to go with a kind of a dry brushing effect, which you can totally do, but when I'm trying to work on a miniature which is something of a centerpiece, or a character, anything kind of like this, I tend to spend a little bit more time working on those features so that there's a more natural transition and I have more control with how I apply my tones. So working here, we go through the entire brown palette. We start on Rhinoxide, working in Mournfang, Scrag Brown, XV88 here, which is the transition color from going between brown into kind of a cream color. So you have to be careful with how you apply that XV88. It also allows us time to work on the leather components like this holster here, and some cool little scratch marks as well, which help sell it as a realistic effect and make it stand out from the other kind of brown components like this skull, which we're working with more like a seamless blend. Xantri Dust, again, very powerful color as we start to introduce it, and how you apply that color across the entire material that you're working on can often determine what type of material it ends up looking like. Like this skull here, hitting the highest points with the Xantri Dust, I'm going to make it look like bone. Anyway, it's a long process, but ultimately quite rewarding, so I recommend doing it for your centerpiece miniatures like this. Up next, we have the slightly more complicated flesh tone segment of this miniature. I would say this is probably the most complex part of the acrylic tones. And what we're going to be doing here is trying to make sure that we're simulating the effect of blood flow going on under the skin, so it's not just kind of like dead flesh. In order to do this, we have to start with a very kind of dark purple base coat, like Galvorback red, working in Screamer pink and stuff like that. However, to make sure that we don't have sort of like very strong transitions between this and the final skin tone, we add glazes between each layer. Now a glaze is like a very, very watered down layer, which is so watered down it's almost like a wash, and we apply that after each new layer that we put down. So every time I do say Screamer pink, we're going to do a glaze of Screamer pink afterwards, and that's to make sure that the transition between the newest layer and the previous ones is more seamless, so it actually looks a lot more natural. For things like skin, this is very important, as we typically don't have harsh transition lines between our shadowed areas and our brighter areas. So we worked through a whole process of introducing pink horror, going from Screamer pink into that pink horror, and then gradually easing our way into skin tones like Rackheart flesh, Pallid Witch flesh, Flayed One flesh, all the brighter, more natural skin tones that are sort of representative of that Codex cover art. But between each one, we have a glaze layer to make sure that everything is being unified well and blended together seamlessly. This is a long process, and you have to be patient to make sure that the glaze is dry between each new step. But ultimately, what you get is a really nice, very realistic effect that can be worked on later in interesting kind of oil blending ways. But it is a tough technique, as I say, maybe not something that you can kind of get straight away on the first go. So if you're new to glazes or this sort of a method, I would recommend trying it on a spare piece of skin tone or a head or something like that before you dive into a more complicated miniature like this guy here. Anyway, let's see how it comes out. That's going to be coming up right here in front of you. When we arrive at the point of highlighting with Pallid Witch Flesh and then Flayed One Flesh after this, we have to be very careful with how we actually apply these bright skin tone colors, because if we're overzealous with our application, if we start to kind of put it down all over the skin tones that we've carefully worked on blending up and uniting together, everything becomes a bit washed out, a bit too pale, and we don't really sell that kind of blood flow effect going on underneath the skin, which is a very kind of natural and organic sort of look that makes it different from the rest of the miniature. So it's very important when you're working on these layers that you're very careful with the application, hitting only the highest points of each muscle group and things like that. You can see here, we're working on the inside of that muscle, the topmost points, making sure that it's not going everywhere so that the miniature doesn't end up being washed out. The Iron Metallics segment is actually very, very simple for this miniature. We don't want to make it too bright because there's already a lot of bright colors going on with this guy. So what we've done is we've base coated it with a paint from Amomig called Gunmetal, which is quite a dark iron color and dries in a nice matte finish, which is a great look for all the kind of chains, the chainmail and the gun weapon casings going on this guy. Again, we have a very bright skin tone and a very bright red, so we want to make sure that our metallics are a little bit more muted here. Off camera, we have added an enamel wash of dark brown for green vehicles all over this miniature and cleaned it up using our Q-tip method. Now, if you're not familiar with enamel washes, I recommend that you check out some of the previous videos on the channel or elsewhere for how to use those, because they're a little bit complicated. But essentially what they do is they filter the miniature through a kind of a medium, we'll say, in this case a kind of a grainy dark brown, so that the overall kind of tone becomes very grimdark in its application. Now afterwards we're coming back in with our Canoptic alloy to add a little bit of a highlight to our bronze to make sure that we're still framing that red armor in a nice and noticeable way, which jumps out from the overall final kind of filtered effect. But overall we're kind of getting into those grimdark territories now, so after this we're going to move on with some OSL. So my OSL technique is a little bit different and unique to the kind of normal ones, and it doesn't involve an airbrush. We start off here with a base coat in the area of the glow with the brightest kind of color that we're going to be using, which in this case is Baharoth Blue, the color of the eye lens. We highlight just around the kind of trim area around that eye lens, but nothing more than that. Now what we do from here is we add a very dark blue wash, in this case Drakenhof Nightshade, to the area around the eye lens, pushing past the area that the glow would naturally kind of hit. This is a way to kind of filter and tint the overall area into a kind of blue that's going to suit us. From here we procedurally add glazes. Now, we've talked about glazes for the skin tones, but in this case, we take a somewhat dark, kind of a medium blue, Calidor Sky in this case, and we add that glaze all around the eye lenses. With each successive glaze after this, we are going to use a brighter blue and work closer towards the eye lens, leaving a little bit of that previous glaze showing through on the outmost edges. In this way, we get a kind of natural glowing effect, where as the light kind of comes closer and closer towards the eye lens, it gets brighter and brighter, and further away it gets darker and darker. Here we're using Lothern Blue to really kind of close in around that eye lens and make sure that it's kind of bright in that immediate area. Following this, we're going to come back with Baharoth Blue and do another kind of highlight layer right on the eye lens and the immediate area around. And to sell the final effect, we're going to mix in just a touch of white scar to make sure that we're closing out this miniature in a bright and interesting way that draws the eye immediately to the helmet. Alright, so that is going to conclude the tutorial for this one. I hope that you found this a rather interesting way of painting the 40k Berserker in the kind of classic color scheme of the World Eaters. Now, as I say, this was all done on Twitch, so if you want to kind of catch more of this, you can find us over on the Red Path 8 on Twitch. The link is down in the description below. I'd love to see you there. It's always fun to hang out and chat with people while we're painting some minis, and hey, it might help you tuck into your own backlog as well. That's it for me for this one though. I hope you've enjoyed it. Let me know down below if you'd like more kind of compilations of various painting streams like this, or if it's not really your style. In any case, I'd love to hear how we can improve this new little mini-series. But until the next one, folks, thank you so much for watching. Stay healthy, stay safe, and kill, maim, burn.